The mahogany conference table stretched between us like a battlefield. Uncle Robert's smug smile had frozen mid-laugh, his thick fingers still drumming what he thought was a victory beat. My cousin Derek slouched in his chair, car keys already dangling from his hand like he owned the place. The lawyer's voice cut through their confidence like a blade through silk, and to my beloved niece, for her years of unwavering care and devotion. Uncle Robert's face drained of color. Derek's keys hit the table with a metallic crash that echoed through the sudden silence. I felt my grandmother's sapphire ring, the one they'd forgotten I was wearing, press warm against my palm as I folded my hands. The lake house deed slid across the polished wood toward me, and for the first time in 34 years, I understood what power felt like. My name is Victoria, and this is the story of how I learned that sometimes the people who hurt you the most are the ones preparing you for your greatest victory. The funeral reception was winding down when Uncle Robert cornered me by the dessert table, his bourbon breath hot against my ear. "You know, Vicky," he said, using that diminutive I'd hated since childhood, "Derek's been talking to a real estate agent about Grandma's lake house. Market's hot right now. Could get 185, maybe more." I set down my untouched slice of coffee cake, my stomach clenching. "The lawyer hasn't even read the will yet, Uncle Robert." His laugh was ugly, knowing. "Honey, let's be realistic. Derek was her favorite grandson. Hell, he was her only grandson. You think she'd leave that prime real estate to?" He gestured vaguely at me, his wedding ring catching the fluorescent church light. "Well, you know." The words hit like ice water. "You know, the divorced daughter. The one who'd moved back to help. The one who wasn't enough. She might have considered what? That you spent the last 3 years wiping her ass?" His voice dropped lower, meaner. "Look, I get it. You put in time. But time doesn't equal blood, sweetheart. Derek's got the name, the business degree, the wife and kids. He's got a future worth investing in." Across the room, Derek was holding court near the coffee urn, regaling Aunt Linda and Cousin Beth with some work story. His pregnant wife, Melissa, sat in a folding chair looking exhausted, one hand resting on her belly. They'd driven up from Atlanta that morning. First time they'd visited Grandma in 2 years. Derek barely knew her, I whispered. Uncle Robert's meaty hand landed on my shoulder, heavy and condescending. "He didn't need to know her, honey. He loved her. Family loves family. Simple as that." The casual cruelty of it stole my breath. 3 years. 3 years of driving the 40-minute route to Grandma's house every Tuesday and Friday after my teaching job ended. 3 years of grocery shopping, medication management, doctor appointments. 3 years of sitting through her stories about Uncle Robert's childhood, about Derek's baseball games, about the family I'd somehow never quite belonged to despite carrying their DNA. "The thing is," Uncle Robert continued, oblivious to my silence, "Derek's already talked to a contractor. The place needs work, but the bones are solid. Could flip it quick, or maybe turn it into a rental property." Smart kid, thinking ahead like that. I watched Derek throw his head back laughing at something Aunt Linda said. He caught me looking and raised his beer bottle in a mock toast, his grin wide and proprietorial. Even from across the room, I could read his expression. "Thanks for keeping the old lady company while the real family lived their lives." "The reading's tomorrow," I managed. "Formality." Uncle Robert shrugged. "Besides, what would you do with a lake house anyway? You can barely afford your apartment." No offense. None taken. Because he was right, wasn't he? My divorce had left me financially gutted. The teaching salary barely covered my studio rent and Emma's college expenses. I'd been eating peanut butter sandwiches for dinner 3 nights a week to make my car payment. But Grandma had known that. During those long afternoons when I'd helped her sort through old photo albums, she'd listened to my struggles without judgment. When I'd broken down crying about the divorce papers, about feeling like a failure, she'd handed me tissues and made tea and told me about her own struggles as a young mother. "Victoria's a good girl," she'd say when Uncle Robert would call during my visits, his voice loud enough through the phone that I could hear him asking if Derek had visited lately. "She's got a good heart." Uncle Robert drained his bourbon and clapped my shoulder again. "Don't look so glum, Vicky. You did your duty." Grandma appreciated that, I'm sure. But now it's time for the grown-ups to handle the estate. The grown-ups. As if I were still 17, as if 3 years of graduate school and 15 years of teaching elementary kids hadn't qualified me for adult status in this family. Derek approached us, Melissa trailing behind with one hand pressed to her lower back. Up close, I could see the calculation in his eyes, the same look he'd worn as a kid when he'd figured out how to pin the blame for broken windows and missing cookies on someone else. "Aunt Victoria," he said, and even my formal name sounded mocking coming from him. "Dad and I were just talking about tomorrow. I hope there won't be any awkwardness. About the house, I mean." Melissa shot him a sharp look. "Derek, what?" "I'm just saying, it would be easier for everyone if we kept things simple. No hurt feelings, no family drama. Grandma wouldn't want that." The mention of Grandma's name in his mouth made my teeth clench. When had he ever cared what she wanted? When he'd skipped her 80th birthday party for a golf tournament? When he'd promised to visit for Christmas and then canceled last minute for a ski trip? "You're right," I heard myself say. "Grandma wouldn't want family drama." Derek's smile was pure relief. "Exactly. See? I knew you'd be reasonable about this." Reasonable. The word tasted bitter. I'd been reasonable my whole life. Reasonable when my ex-husband decided our marriage was limiting his potential. Reasonable when my parents suggested I move closer to help with Grandma since you don't have a husband to worry about anymore. Reasonable when Uncle Robert's calls always came during dinner time. When Derek's visits always coincided with holidays where Grandma might slip him cash. "The thing is," Derek continued, warming to his theme, "Melissa and I have been looking at investment properties anyway. This just makes sense. Location, 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 right?" He gestured toward his wife, who was now sitting heavily in a nearby chair, her face pale. She looked like she wanted to disappear, and I wondered, not for the first time, if Derek's casual cruelty extended beyond family gatherings. "Plus," Uncle Robert added, "Derek's got the business connections to handle this properly. Real estate's complicated. Taxes, inspections, all that legal stuff. You'd be in over your head." In over my head. Because teaching 28 third graders and managing a classroom budget and coordinating parent conferences was child's play compared to, what? Making phone calls? Reading documents? The receiving line had finally ended, and people were beginning to drift toward the parking lot. I could see my mother across the room, gathering her purse and looking for me with that particular expression that meant it was time to go, time to stop making conversation, time to retreat to our separate corners and pretend this gathering had been about grief instead of inheritance speculation. Derek checked his phone. "Anyway, we should head back to the hotel. Early morning tomorrow." He looked at me with something that might have been sympathy if you didn't know him well enough to recognize the satisfaction underneath. "You okay getting home?" "I know today was hard." Hard. As if the hardest part had been the funeral service and not this conversation. As if the hardest part hadn't been watching my grandmother's son and grandson divide up her life before her body was even in the ground. "I'm fine," I said. Good. Good. Derek pocketed his phone. "See you tomorrow, then." For the formality. They walked away, Uncle Robert's hand guiding Derek's elbow as they talked in low, pleased voices about contractors and market values and vacation rental potential. Melissa followed behind them, one hand still pressed to her back, moving carefully in a way that made me think this pregnancy hadn't been easy. I stood alone by the dessert table, surrounded by the detritus of other people's social obligations. Paper plates with half-eaten cake, lipstick stains on coffee cups, the sweet, cloying smell of too many flowers and too much perfume, and the particular sadness that clings to church basements. My phone buzzed. A text from my daughter Emma, away at college. "How was today, Mom? Thinking of you." I typed back, "Fine. We'll call tonight." But even as I sent it, I knew I wouldn't tell her about this conversation. Emma had enough to worry about with midterms and her part-time job and the student loans that kept us both awake at night. She didn't need to know that her great-grandmother's death had become a real estate transaction, or that her uncle and cousin had already written us off as irrelevant to the family legacy. Outside, car engines were starting up. Uncle Robert's voice carried through the parking lot, loud and jovial. "Derek, you've got the golden touch, boy. Just like your old man." I gathered my purse and my grandmother's memory and my carefully maintained dignity, and I walked toward my car with my head high and my heart full of something that wasn't quite anger yet but was definitely done with being reasonable. Tomorrow would come soon enough. The morning of the will reading arrived with the kind of October rain that makes everything look gray and defeated. I sat in my car outside the law office, watching water streak down my windshield and wondering if I was making a mistake by even showing up. My phone had been buzzing since 7 a.m. Derek, with helpful reminders about keeping things simple. Uncle Robert, with suggestions about not making this harder than it needs to be. Even Aunt Linda had called, her voice sticky with false concern. Honey, just remember that Derek has those student loans from business school. And with the baby coming. As if I didn't have student loans. As if Emma's tuition wasn't bleeding me dry. I'd spent the night going through Grandma's recipe box, the one thing I'd managed to take from her house before Uncle Robert changed the locks for security purposes. Her handwriting covered index cards in careful script, banana bread for Victoria. She always liked extra walnuts. Sugar cookies for Derek's visits. He won't eat anything with coconut. Even in her recipes, she'd been taking care of everyone. Making sure Derek got his favorites during his rare appearances, while I got the comfort food during my regular Tuesday visits when she'd noticed I looked too thin, too stressed, too worn down by life. The law office door chimed as I entered, and I found myself in a waiting room that screamed old money. Leather chairs, mahogany paneling, the kind of understated elegance that probably cost more than my annual salary. Derek and Uncle Robert were already there, looking comfortable and entitled in their matching navy blazers. Melissa sat beside Derek, her pregnancy making her look fragile in the oversized chair. Victoria. Uncle Robert's voice boomed across the quiet space. There she is. Ready for this? The receptionist, a woman about my age with kind eyes, looked up from her computer. Miss Chen? Mr. Whitmore is ready for you now. We filed into the inner office, where a man in his 60s sat behind a desk that probably cost more than my car. He had the particular gravity that comes with handling other people's final wishes, and his eyes were sharper than his grandfatherly appearance suggested. Please, sit. He gestured to chairs arranged in a semicircle. Derek immediately took the center seat, Uncle Robert beside him. I ended up on the far right, closest to the window, watching rain fall on the courthouse across the street. Before we begin, Mr. Whitmore said, opening a thick folder, I want to express my condolences. Eleanor was a remarkable woman. I had the privilege of knowing her for over 15 years. Derek shifted impatiently. Uncle Robert nodded with practiced solemnity. Now then. Mr. Whitmore adjusted his glasses. Eleanor's will is quite straightforward in some respects, though she did make several amendments over the past few years. The most recent was executed just 3 months ago. 3 months ago. That would have been right after Grandma's hospitalization for pneumonia. I'd spent a week sleeping in the chair beside her bed, terrifying the nurses with my vigil while Uncle Robert sent flowers and Derek texted his concern from Atlanta. The personal effects, jewelry, photographs, household items, she's left detailed instructions for distribution. Mr. Whitmore's voice was steady, professional. However, the significant assets require more explanation. Uncle Robert leaned forward. Derek's hand found his phone, probably already calculating contractor estimates. Eleanor owned her home outright, valued at approximately $45,000. There's also a modest savings account, about $8,000. Mr. Whitmore paused. And then there's the lake house. The lake house. Even the name carried weight in our family. Grandma and Grandpa had bought it in 1967, back when the lake was just a quiet fishing spot instead of the premium vacation destination it had become. 5 acres of pine trees sloping down to deep water, a 4-bedroom log cabin with a wraparound porch and a dock that Grandpa had built with his own hands. The lake house is currently valued at $185,000, as Derek mentioned yesterday. Derek's smile was subtle but unmistakable. Beside me, Melissa shifted uncomfortably, one hand resting on her belly. Eleanor was very specific about her intentions regarding the property. Mr. Whitmore pulled out a separate document. She actually came to see me several times over the past year to discuss her decision. Something in his tone made my chest tighten. Uncle Robert's confident posture faltered slightly. She was concerned about fairness, about recognition of sacrifice and dedication. The lawyer's eyes found mine across the room. She spoke often about the difference between obligation and choice, between duty and love. My grandmother's voice echoed in my memory. Some people visit because they have to, Victoria. Some people visit because they want to. I always know the difference. The lake house, Mr. Whitmore continued, his voice gaining strength, along with all furnishings, personal property, and mineral rights, she leaves to her granddaughter, Victoria Chen, in recognition of her unwavering devotion and care. The words hit the room like a physical blow. Derek's phone clattered to the floor. Uncle Robert's face went through a spectrum of emotions, confusion, disbelief, rage, before settling on something cold and calculating. Derek's voice cracked. That's not possible. I'm afraid it is. Mr. Whitmore's tone remained steady. Eleanor was very clear about her reasoning. She felt that Victoria had proven her love through consistent action, not just family obligation. Uncle Robert found his voice. She wasn't thinking clearly. The pneumonia, the medications, actually, Eleanor was quite lucid. We discussed this extensively, and I'm satisfied that she was of sound mind and acting of her own free will. Mr. Whitmore turned a page. She also left a letter for the family, which she asked me to read aloud. The silence in the room was deafening. Outside, rain continued its steady assault on the windows. "My dear family," Mr. Whitmore began, his voice taking on the cadence of my grandmother's measured speech. "If you're hearing this, then I'm gone, and I hope you'll forgive an old woman's need to explain herself." Derek was staring at the floor, his face red with embarrassment or fury or both. Uncle Robert's jaw worked like he was chewing something bitter. "Victoria, my darling girl, you may wonder why I've done this. The truth is, you gave me something precious in my final years. You gave me your time not because you had to, but because you chose to. You listened to my stories, even the ones you'd heard before. You brought me books from the library and flowers from your garden. You held my hand during the scary parts." My throat was closing up, making it hard to breathe. This couldn't be happening. Things like this didn't happen to people like me. "Robert, Derek, I love you both. But love isn't just feeling, it's doing. It's showing up on the hard days, not just the holidays. It's caring about someone's daily happiness, not just their inheritance potential." Uncle Robert stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "This is ridiculous. We'll contest this." "She was manipulated, you're welcome to try," Mr. Whitmore said calmly. But I should mention that Eleanor anticipated that possibility. She underwent a psychological evaluation specifically to confirm her competency, and she videotaped her final testament. She was quite thorough. Thorough. That was Grandma. The woman who still balanced her checkbook by hand and kept backup copies of everything important in a fireproof box. Derek finally looked up, his eyes bright with something between tears and rage. 3 years, he said quietly. 3 years you were there, planning this. Manipulating her. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Melissa reached for his hand, but he pulled away. "Derek." My voice sounded strange to my own ears. "I never asked for this." "Bullshit." The word exploded from him. "You think we're stupid? You think we don't know why you suddenly became the devoted granddaughter? Christ, Victoria, we knew you were desperate, but this." Uncle Robert's hand fell heavy on Derek's shoulder. "Let's go. This isn't over." They stood to leave, Uncle Robert's face a mask of controlled fury, Derek shaking with humiliation. But Melissa remained seated, one hand pressed to her lower back, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Melissa?" Derek's voice was sharp with impatience. She struggled to her feet slowly, then turned to me. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, "for what he said. It wasn't fair." Then she was gone, leaving me alone with Mr. Whitmore and the weight of an inheritance I'd never imagined possible. The lawyer was watching me carefully. "Are you all right, Miss Chen?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure it was true. "Is it real? The will, I mean. Completely legal and binding." He smiled for the first time. "Eleanor was very proud of you, you know. She said you were the only one who loved her enough to let her be herself, cranky days, good days, and everything in between." Through the window, I watched Uncle Robert's SUV pull out of the parking lot too fast, tires spinning on wet asphalt. In a few hours, the phone calls would start. The accusations. The lawyers Derek would hire to challenge the will. But for now, I sat in a leather chair worth more than my monthly rent, holding the deed to a lake house, and wondering how a woman who'd felt invisible her entire life had suddenly become the center of a storm. The phone calls started before I even made it home from the lawyer's office. The first was from my mother, her voice tight with that particular brand of anxiety that meant someone in the family was upset with her by extension. "Victoria, honey, Robert just called me. He's very concerned. He thinks maybe you pressured Grandma somehow." I pulled into my apartment complex parking lot, rain still drumming on the roof of my 15-year-old Honda. "I didn't pressure anyone, Mom. I know that. Of course I know that. But honey, maybe you could talk to Derek? Work something out? The family's so upset, and with Melissa pregnant." The family. As if I weren't part of it. As if I'd somehow become an outsider the moment Grandma's will made me inconveniently relevant. "I have to go, Mom. I'll call you later." The second call came as I was climbing the stairs to my apartment, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the keys. Aunt Linda's number flashed on the screen. Victoria Rose Chen. She used my full name like a weapon. I cannot believe what I'm hearing. After everything this family has done for you. Everything they'd done for me. I tried to remember what that might be. The grudging inclusion at holiday dinners? The condescending explanations about how family money should be handled? The consistent assumption that I was too fragile, too poor, too divorced to contribute anything meaningful? Aunt Linda, that boy has been planning his future around that house. He's got a business plan, Victoria. A real plan. What are you going to do with it? Let it rot while you can't even afford to maintain it? I fumbled my keys, dropping them on the concrete landing. I haven't decided anything yet. Haven't decided. Her laugh was bitter. Well, you better decide fast, because Derek's lawyer says there are ways to challenge this. Mental incompetence. Undue influence. Grandma was 91 years old, for God's sake. She didn't know what she was doing. The keys felt cold and slippery in my hands. She knew exactly what she was doing. Did she? Or did she just get confused about which grandchild actually mattered to this family? The line went dead. I stood there on the landing, rain soaking through my jacket, and wondered how a woman who'd been invisible at family gatherings for 34 years had suddenly become the villain in everyone else's story. Inside my studio apartment, I sat on my second-hand couch and stared at the deed Mr. Whitmore had given me. Heavy paper, official seals, my name typed in black ink, Victoria Chen. Not Victoria Rose. Not Vicky. Just Victoria, the name Grandma had always used, the name that made me feel like I mattered. My phone buzzed with a text from Derek, "We need to talk. This is bigger than just you and me." Then another from Uncle Robert, "Don't make this ugly, Victoria. Think about what's best for everyone." Everyone. Everyone except me, apparently. I drove to the lake house that evening, partly because I needed to see it with my own eyes and partly because I couldn't stand the thought of another phone call. The 40-minute drive took me through small towns and pine forests, past the familiar landmarks I'd memorized during 3 years of twice-weekly visits. The house sat at the end of a gravel road, surrounded by trees that had turned autumn gold and red. It looked smaller than I remembered, more weathered. The wraparound porch sagged slightly, and several shutters hung crooked. Uncle Robert had been right about one thing: it needed work. But it was beautiful. God, it was beautiful. I used the key Mr. Whitmore had given me, the same key Grandma had carried in her purse for 57 years. The door opened with a familiar creak, and I stepped into the living room where I'd spent so many afternoons listening to her stories about Grandpa's fishing expeditions and the neighbors' various scandals. Everything was exactly as she'd left it. Her reading glasses on the side table next to her chair. A half-finished crossword puzzle on the coffee table. The Afghan she'd been knitting for Derek's baby draped over the couch, needles still attached, waiting for hands that would never pick them up again. I walked through the room slowly, touching surfaces, opening drawers, trying to understand what I was supposed to do with all this space, all this responsibility. The kitchen still smelled like her lavender hand soap. The master bedroom still had Grandpa's cologne bottle on the dresser, though he'd been gone 15 years. In the back bedroom, the one she'd called the memory room, I found the boxes she'd mentioned during her last hospital stay. "When I'm gone, Victoria, you look in the memory room. There are things there you should see. Photo albums, mostly. Pictures of family gatherings from before my birth, when Uncle Robert was still young and hopeful looking, before success had made him cruel. Pictures of Derek as a baby, cherubic and innocent. Pictures of my grandmother as a young mother, holding Uncle Robert with the kind of fierce love that transcends everything else." And at the bottom of the third box, I found a manila envelope with my name on it in Grandma's careful handwriting. Inside were copies of bank statements, 3 years' worth of them. Every month, without fail, a $500 transfer from Eleanor Mason's checking account to Robert Mason's business account. Underneath those, a letter in Derek's handwriting: "Grandma, I know it's asking a lot, but the down payment for the house is more than we expected. Could you help us out? Just until the business takes off. We'll pay it back, I promise." $18,000. Over 3 years, while I'd been driving to her house twice a week, bringing groceries and sitting through doctor appointments, Uncle Robert and Derek had been quietly bleeding her savings account dry. The last statement was dated 2 weeks before her death. The account balance was $847. I sat on the floor of the memory room, surrounded by photographs and evidence, and felt something fundamental shift inside my chest. Not anger, exactly. Something cooler. Something more dangerous. My phone rang. Derek's number. "Victoria. His voice was strained but trying for reasonable. Look, I know today was emotional for everyone. But I've been thinking, and maybe we can work something out. I held the bank statements in my free hand, feeling their weight. Work something out how? Well, you know you can't afford to keep the place. The property taxes alone are probably more than your rent. And with the maintenance costs, insurance, it's a money pit, really. So here's what I'm thinking. You sell it to me for, say, $120. That's fair market value for a property that needs work. You get a nice chunk of change, enough to pay off your student loans, maybe help with Emma's college. I get a project to work on. Everybody wins. $120,000, $65,000 less than the appraised value, for a house I'd owned for approximately 8 hours. That's generous of you, Derek. I mean, I'm trying to be fair here. Family should take care of family, right? And honestly, Victoria, you'd be in over your head trying to manage a property like this. In over my head. The same phrase Uncle Robert had used yesterday, as if being a woman, being divorced, being financially struggling automatically disqualified me from basic competence. I need to think about it, I said. Sure. But don't think too long, okay? I've got contractors ready to start, and the market won't stay hot forever. After he hung up, I sat in the growing darkness, listening to the house settle around me. Somewhere in the kitchen, the old refrigerator hummed to life. Outside, wind moved through the pine trees with a sound like whispered secrets. I thought about Grandma sitting in this same room, going through these same boxes, making the decision to document her son's and grandson's casual theft. I thought about her adding my name to the will 3 months ago, right after learning that Derek and Uncle Robert had taken nearly every penny of her savings while she'd worried about having enough money for her medications. And I thought about Derek's offer, $120,000 for a house worth $185,000. A 40% discount on a property he'd been planning to flip for maximum profit. The family that took care of family. My phone buzzed with another text, this time from a number I didn't recognize. This is Derek's lawyer. We need to discuss your options regarding the estate. Call me. I turned off my phone and sat in my grandmother's house, surrounded by the evidence of 3 years of calculated exploitation, and began to understand that this wasn't just about an inheritance anymore. This was about justice, and for the first time in my life, I was the one with the power to deliver it. I spent that night in Grandma's house, sleeping in her bed with the manila envelope tucked under my pillow like a talisman. The sheets still smelled like her lavender lotion, and every creak of the old log walls felt like a whispered encouragement. By morning, I had a plan. The first call I made was to Emma, catching her between classes at college. Mom? Is everything okay? You sound different. Different. I supposed I was. I need to ask you something, honey. How much do you know about real estate law? Weird question for 8 a.m., but yeah, I'm actually taking a business law elective this semester. Why? I told her about the will, the inheritance, the family's reaction. But I didn't tell her about the bank statements yet. That revelation needed to be handled carefully. Jesus, Mom. I mean, good for you, but Uncle Robert must be losing his mind. He's not happy. I walked out onto the wraparound porch, looking across the lake where morning mist was rising off the water. Emma, if someone wanted to challenge a will on grounds of undue influence, what would they need to prove? That's actually pretty hard to do. They'd need to show that you isolated Grandma from the family, or that you were in a position of power over her, or that the will was totally inconsistent with her previous intentions. Emma's voice grew more animated as she warmed to the legal puzzle. Why? Are they threatening to contest it? Derek's hired a lawyer. Of course he has. Emma's disgust was palpable. Mom, you spent 3 years taking care of her. You earned this. Don't let them bully you. Earned this. My 20-year-old daughter understood something that a room full of adults couldn't grasp. The second call I made was to Derek's lawyer, a man named Patterson whose voice carried the particular arrogance of someone who'd never been told no by a woman he considered beneath him. Ms. Chen, I'm glad you called. My client is prepared to be reasonable about this unfortunate situation. Unfortunate situation. As if Grandma's final wishes were a clerical error that needed correcting. What exactly does reasonable mean? Well, obviously the will needs to be challenged, but Derek doesn't want to drag the family through a lengthy legal battle. He's prepared to offer you a fair settlement. I let the silence stretch until he felt compelled to fill it. $100,000, cash, for a quick deed transfer. That's very generous, considering the legal fees you'll face when we prove undue influence. 100,000. 20,000 less than Derek's offer yesterday, 40,000 less than his father's generous proposal. They were negotiating against themselves, each offer revealing exactly how desperate they were becoming. I'll need to think about it. Don't think too long, Miss Chen. The longer this drags out, the more expensive it becomes for everyone. And frankly, you don't have the resources for a prolonged legal fight. After I hung up, I made one more call to Mr. Whitmore. Victoria, how are you holding up? I need to ask you something confidential. If I wanted to investigate financial elder abuse, what would that look like? The pause on the other end was telling. What kind of financial elder abuse? I told him about the bank statements, the monthly transfers, Derek's mounting debts that had somehow become Grandma's problem. Mr. Whitmore listened without interruption, making occasional humming noises that suggested none of this was entirely surprising. Eleanor mentioned some concerns about money, he said finally. She didn't give me specifics, but she asked several questions about her rights if family members had been taking advantage of her generosity. What did you tell her? That taking money from an elderly relative under false pretenses, especially if there was coercion involved, could constitute financial elder abuse. It's a felony in this state, Victoria. If proven, it could result in criminal charges and mandatory restitution. A felony. I sat with that information, feeling its weight. What would someone need to prove a case like that? Documentation. Bank records, correspondence, witnesses to any conversations about repayment or coercion. The kind of evidence a careful person might keep if they suspected they were being taken advantage of. The kind of evidence currently sitting in a manila envelope on Grandma's kitchen table. I spent the afternoon going through the rest of the memory room, and what I found made my stomach turn. Not just the bank statements, but copies of Derek's increasingly desperate letters and emails, promises to repay that grew more elaborate and less sincere with each iteration, references to temporary setbacks and business opportunities and just until we get on our feet. And then, in Grandma's own handwriting, notes from phone conversations, dates, times, what was said. Derek asking for help with a car payment. Uncle Robert explaining why the family construction business needed an emergency loan. Both of them promising repayment that never came, each request followed by longer and longer periods of silence until the next financial crisis arose. She documented everything. Methodically, carefully, probably knowing exactly what she was building toward. The last entry was dated 2 weeks before her death. Robert called again about the property taxes on his office building. Says the business is having cash flow problems. I told him I couldn't help anymore. He got angry. Said family should stick together, that I was being selfish. Derek called later, said I was hurting Melissa's pregnancy stress by refusing to help. I'm tired of being their bank account. My grandmother, at 91, finally finding the courage to say no. And they'd punished her for it. By evening, I knew what I had to do. Derek's truck was in Uncle Robert's driveway when I arrived at 6 o'clock, along with 2 other vehicles I didn't recognize. Through the front window, I could see them gathered around the dining room table, Derek, Uncle Robert, Aunt Linda, and 2 men in suits who could only be lawyers, planning their strategy, figuring out how to discredit me, how to challenge Grandma's mental capacity, how to paint me as the manipulative gold digger who'd stolen their rightful inheritance. I rang the doorbell. Uncle Robert answered, his face cycling through surprise, irritation, and calculation before settling on false welcome. Victoria, this is unexpected. Come in, come in. The dining room fell silent as I entered. Derek looked haggard, older than his 32 years. Aunt Linda's mouth was pressed into a thin line of disapproval. The lawyers, Patterson and another man who introduced himself as Williams, radiated the particular smugness of men who'd built careers on intimidating people who couldn't afford to fight back. We were just discussing the situation, Uncle Robert said, gesturing to an empty chair. Have a seat. Let's work this out like family. Like family. The phrase had lost all meaning over the past 48 hours. I remained standing and placed the manila envelope on the table. What's this? Derek's voice was suspicious. Evidence, I said quietly, of financial elder abuse. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Patterson reached for the envelope, but I pulled it back. $18,000, I continued. Over 3 years, taken from a 91-year-old woman who worried about having enough money for her heart medication. Uncle Robert's face went white, then red. That was family business. Private loans, where's the repayment plan? Where are the signed loan documents? Where's any evidence that you intended to pay her back? Derek stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood. This is bullshit, Victoria. We're family. Families help each other. Help each other. I opened the envelope and pulled out the last bank statement. $847. That's what she had left when she died. After 57 years of marriage, 40 years of widowhood, a lifetime of careful saving, $800. Aunt Linda's gasp was audible. Even she hadn't known how bad it had gotten. But here's the interesting thing, I continued, my voice gaining strength. Financial elder abuse is a felony, punishable by up to 5 years in prison and mandatory restitution at triple the amount taken. Patterson cleared his throat. Miss Chen, you're making serious accusations. I'm stating facts. Facts that are documented in your client's own handwriting. I pulled out Derek's letters, Uncle Robert's emails. Facts that show a pattern of exploitation over multiple years. Derek was shaking now, his hands clenched at his sides. You can't prove coercion. She gave us that money willingly. Did she? Because according to these notes, she told you no several times. And according to her final conversation with Uncle Robert, he told her she was being selfish for refusing to fund his property tax bill. The silence stretched until Uncle Robert found his voice, smaller than I'd ever heard it. What do you want, Victoria? What do I want? I looked around the room, at these people who'd spent my entire life treating me like an inconvenience, a burden, a problem to be managed. I want you to stop calling me. I want you to stop threatening legal challenges you know you can't win. And I want you to leave me alone to grieve my grandmother in peace. I gathered the papers and headed for the door, then turned back. Oh, and Derek? Your offer is declined. All of them. I think I'll keep the house after all. I left them sitting there in their expensive suits and their shattered plans, and for the first time in 34 years, I felt like I could breathe. 3 weeks later, I was standing in Grandma's kitchen making coffee when Melissa knocked on the front door. She looked better than she had at the lawyer's office, color in her cheeks, less of that exhausted slouch that had made her seem fragile. But her eyes were uncertain as I invited her in. I hope it's okay that I came, she said, settling carefully into one of the kitchen chairs. Derek doesn't know I'm here. I poured 2 cups of coffee, adding cream to hers the way I remembered from family gatherings. How are you feeling? The pregnancy, I mean. Better. Much better, actually. She wrapped her hands around the mug like she needed its warmth. Victoria, I need to apologize. For what Derek said that day, for everything, really. I sat across from her at the same table where Grandma had taught me to play gin rummy, where we'd sorted through old photographs, where she'd told me stories about her own struggles as a young mother that had made me feel less alone in my failures. You don't need to apologize for Derek's behavior. Don't I? Melissa's voice was quiet but steady. I've been married to him for 4 years. I've watched him treat people badly and told myself it wasn't my business. I've watched him take things he didn't earn and justified it by saying he deserved them. She looked around the kitchen, taking in the handmade curtains, the mismatched dishes, the evidence of a life lived simply but with care. I never said anything when he talked about this place like it was already his. I should have. Through the window, I could see the lake, its surface mirror calm in the October afternoon. A blue heron stood motionless in the shallows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. What's happening with the legal challenge? Melissa's laugh was bitter. There is no legal challenge. Derek's lawyer dropped the case after you showed them those bank statements. Apparently, threatening financial elder abuse charges tends to make attorneys nervous about their licenses. I'd wondered about that. Patterson hadn't called back after I'd mentioned the possibility of criminal prosecution. And Derek? Derek is learning to live with disappointment. She touched her belly absently. The construction business is struggling. Has been for 2 years. That's why they kept going to your grandmother for money. Uncle Robert's business? Derek works for his father, but there's no real separation. They've been robbing Peter to pay Paul for months, using family money to cover business expenses. Melissa's voice grew stronger, more certain. I didn't know how bad it was until after. Until after that meeting. When Derek started talking about bankruptcy lawyers, the heron struck, coming up with a fish that glittered silver in its beak. One moment of perfect timing, of patience rewarded. I filed for legal separation last week, Melissa said quietly. I looked at her more carefully. The new steadiness in her posture, the way she met my eyes directly. Are you okay? Financially, I mean? With the baby coming. My parents offered to help. And I've got a nursing degree I never used after we got married. Derek thought I should focus on being a wife. She shrugged. Turns out I'm pretty good at focusing on being myself. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, two women who'd both learned the difference between family obligation and family love. There's something else, Melissa said. Derek wanted me to ask you. He's embarrassed to do it himself, but he wondered if you'd consider selling him just the dock. Not the house, not the land, just water access. His father thinks they could still salvage some kind of fishing guide business if they had lake access. The audacity of it took my breath away. After everything, the theft, the lies, the attempts to discredit Grandma's final wishes, they still thought they could negotiate their way back into my inheritance. No, I said simply. I didn't think so. But I promised I'd ask. Melissa finished her coffee and stood to leave. Victoria? I'm glad it's you. Who got the house, I mean. She would have wanted it to go to someone who actually loved her. After she left, I walked through the house slowly, room by room, seeing it with new eyes. Not as a burden I couldn't afford, but as a choice I was free to make. Emma had driven down from college the weekend before, full of excitement and business school energy. She'd walked through every room with a notebook, making lists of repairs and improvements, researching contractors and renovation loans. Mom, you could turn this into the most amazing bed and breakfast. Or a writer's retreat. The bones of this place are incredible. A writer's retreat. I liked the sound of that. A place where women could come to find themselves, to write their own stories, to discover that being overlooked by some people just meant you were saving your best self for the ones who mattered. My phone buzzed with a text from Emma. Found a grant program for rural small business development. You should apply. I smiled, typing back, send me the details. The afternoon light was fading when I finally called Mr. Whitmore. Victoria, how are you settling in? I need to ask you about those bank statements. What would happen if I filed a formal elder abuse complaint? Well, that would trigger a criminal investigation. If the state attorney decided to prosecute, Derek and Robert could face felony charges. He paused. The evidence you have is quite compelling. And if they were convicted? Prison time is possible. Mandatory restitution is guaranteed, triple damages, so $54,000 plus interest. His voice grew warmer. Victoria, you'd be doing the right thing. This kind of behavior doesn't stop unless there are consequences. I thought about Grandma documenting every phone call, every request, every broken promise. Building a case she'd never lived to see resolved. File the complaint, I said. That evening, I sat on the wraparound porch with a glass of wine and my grandmother's unfinished knitting. The Afghan for Derek's baby, needles still holding the last stitches she'd made. I pulled out the needles and began unraveling it, row by row, until I had a basket of soft blue yarn ready for a new project. Something for Emma, maybe. Or for my own future, whatever that looked like. My phone rang. Unknown number. Miss Chen? This is Detective Morrison with the State Financial Crimes Unit. We've received your complaint regarding elder abuse. We'd like to schedule an interview. I gave him my availability, my contact information, my promise to provide any documentation he needed. After I hung up, I sat in the gathering darkness, listening to the lake lap against Grandpa's old dock. Somewhere across the water, I could hear laughter from another family's vacation, the sound of people who loved each other well. Uncle Robert and Derek would face justice. Real justice, with real consequences. Not the petty revenge I might have wanted 3 weeks ago, but the kind of accountability that honored Grandma's memory and protected the next vulnerable person they might target. I started knitting, the rhythm of the needles soothing in the autumn air. A new pattern, something beautiful and warm and entirely my own. The porch light drew moths that danced against the windows, and the lake reflected stars that seemed close enough to touch. For the first time in my adult life, I owned something valuable. Something permanent. Something that proved I mattered. But more than that, I owned the knowledge that I'd been loved by someone who saw me clearly, who'd trusted me with her final gift, who believed I deserved better than the scraps other people were willing to throw me. I knitted until the moon rose full over the lake, and I understood finally that home wasn't something you inherited. It was something you claimed.